Okay, we asked if anybody had any questions, and there was a lot of questions, and we thought, okay, let's take a little time and see if we can answer some of these questions. So Eric, you are the official narrator. I don't know what title we should give you. What title would you like for this?
Interrogator. I'll ask the questions.
The interrogator. Okay.
Yes.
Well, that seems appropriate. Okay. So, Mr. Interrogator, what are the questions that you were given to interrogate me with?
So this first one is coming from Scott. What's one thing you think Americans should be taught about American history? He says history, I assume he means American history, that they aren't.
Reducing it to one, I feel like that was the challenge. I think probably the thing that I would point out that we miss the most is understanding context when teaching American history. That you need to judge people in the era of the time in which they lived. It's easy to look back and go, man, people were dumb for doing this or believing this, and not recognizing kind of the growth and evolution of society ideas. When if you look for the last however many thousands of years of recorded human history, one of the very accepted things was slavery. And if you don't understand that's a context of history, then it's very easy to miss the reality when people say, but the founding fathers, many of them owned slaves and they were racist. Well, some of them did own slaves and some of them actually were racist. However, the very first place in the world to begin a political movement against slavery, where actually something happened and successfully states abolished slavery, it was America. This was the first place in the world, but if you don't know what they did or don't understand the context of which they were living, it's easy to misrepresent some of what happened. And I think a lot of what we see now are misrepresentations because we don't study history in context. So I know it's not one specific thing we're not taught, but I think understanding the context, big picture, is one of the areas we get it wrong.
Great answer. Next question.
You're a good interrogator. Complimenting me on the way.
I'll be a little more mean with my response to this one here. Sandy would like to know, back in the day, how would people vote? Like, how would they physically do the action of voting?
Well, sometimes they used a quill pen. Sometimes, I actually don't know exactly what Sandy's asking. So that's so ridiculous. Okay, so it really does depend on the era and on the level of the election, whether it's a local, a state, federal election. There actually were times where you would have a blank piece of paper and you would write down the name of the person you thought would be the best for your representative, for the mayor. This is at times how elections worked. There were different seasons where at times there might be a list of names and you could check the one you wanted, or if you're maybe in the middle of, for example, the Civil War, they actually had voting rolls where they would go out and find the person whose name it was and they'd say, okay, who are you voting for? And they would mark it down. But generally speaking, it was voting in person on the day of the election, and whether it was a blank piece of paper or if you had options on the paper was really the only significant difference. And I actually think it's probably something we should reconsider. Going back to in-person election day voting makes a lot of sense. Maybe have a national holiday so people can't say, well, I couldn't make it. No, we need to, instead of having months of an election with drop ballot boxes, that's the words I was looking for. There should be some things we could learn from history, but I would think, Sandy, hopefully this gives an idea of the question you were asking. It was generally in person on the day, and then whether it was a blank piece of paper or names in the ballot might change, but that's kind of the process of how it worked.
I would give you a compliment there, but I have a reputation that I'm trying to build here, so no compliments that time, but I will give you another question. This one is from Eddie. Eddie wants to know, what happened to the church that made it disengage so completely from politics?
I think there's probably more than one answer. I think there's several things we can point to. A really good one would be when Charles Darwin came out with his book, Origin of Species. There wasn't a great Christian response in that moment. Where we are today, there's a lot of really great apologists who have done a good job explaining the answers to sometimes hard questions of what's been going on. But in that time, when Darwin first came out, the response from many Christian leaders and pastors were, you know what, we're not really worried about some of the science behind maybe origins or development along the way. We're just going to focus on Jesus. And I think one of the mistakes that was made was identifying there's certain parts of culture the Bible doesn't really speak to, that no longer relates to. And we can track this in several moments where significant things happen in culture. And a lot of times the Christian response was, we're not worried about that. We are going to focus on Jesus. And I would say that's part of where the church went wrong. Even to now, where so many Christians and pastors, their belief is the most important thing is we just want people to know Jesus. And now that that's wrong, that is obviously something we care and want people to know about. But it's interesting, Jesus didn't tell the disciples to go into all the world and tell people about me. He said, go into all the world and make disciples, right? Go make disciples of all nations. Making disciples is a very different process than telling people about Jesus. And I think where the church in many ways has gotten it wrong historically, and some even getting it wrong today, is we emphasize more on telling people about Jesus than making disciples, teaching people how to live like Jesus. And that's why there's such a disconnect at times between what pastors are teaching in culture and what the Bible actually says.
One last question here for you. Let's see, Johnny would like to learn about the role of the Supreme Court. He says, I remember you saying that the Supreme Court told Lincoln he couldn't free slaves, but he did. What authority does the Supreme Court have if their decisions can be discarded so freely?
Yes. So first of all, I think there's a little more in the context of the Supreme Court telling Lincoln that he couldn't free slaves. But the Supreme Court, leading up to Lincoln being president, had definitely upheld slavery, had defended slavery. You have the Dred Scott decision. There's a lot of things we could point to where the Supreme Court definitely had a very pro-slavery position in that era. However, Lincoln was able to do some things, and actually there's a reason there were constitutional amendments with the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, because they had to get outside of and around what the U.S. Supreme Court was saying. However, backing up to Supreme Court power in general, what they should and shouldn't do, it's very interesting studying the founders' writings, where whether you read in the Federalist Papers from Madison or Hamilton or John Jay, who all wrote Federalist Papers, the thought behind them is very consistent really from the founding fathers in the founding era, is that the way the Constitution was set up, the most powerful branch is the legislative branch, the weakest branch is the judicial branch, and the judicial branch can never tell the other two branches what to do. That was the founders' idea from their own writings. Now, you find that in the Federalist Papers, which is why I brought up Madison and Hamilton and Jay. It's interesting, though, in the Anti-Federalist Papers, they said, guys, here's the problem with the Constitution. And one of the problems they outlined was that there were not enough constraints put around the judiciary, that you might have some activist, out-of-control judges that would do these things, and there might not be enough constraints to keep them from going the wrong direction. Now, the Federalists would have argued, no, because you can impeach them. They can only be there for a duration of good behavior. And if they're doing things that are unconstitutional, that's bad behavior. They shouldn't be there. But this was one of the debates literally from the founding era. And we have forgotten some of the constraints that guys like Madison or Hamilton or John Jay might have argued. Well, the Constitution actually gives power to the legislative body to be able to limit jurisdictions, or actually to even abolish certain courts. And they can remove these judges through an impeachment process. We've forgotten those ideas. We've forgotten the notion of checks and balances and separation of powers. We've been taught that the three branches are co-equal, which is definitely not what the founding fathers believed or taught. It's not what they created. And now we're told the Supreme Court is the final arbiter of what is constitutional, again, which is contrary to what the guys who wrote the Constitution actually said. But because we don't know that history, we've allowed the Supreme Court to go in a very wrong direction. And so part of what we have to do is reread the Constitution, re-educate the American people, and then we have to start electing officials who know what the Constitution says so that they can actually hold the Supreme Court accountable, or judges in general accountable. All right, Mr. Interrogator, thank you for taking time to interrogate me. We will talk off camera about his interrogation abilities, and we'll work on that going forward. But we appreciate you guys sending in questions. We definitely want to be able to answer these going forward. So if you have more questions, send them in. We didn't get to all the questions that were sent in, so we'll probably do more of these videos trying to answer some of these questions, and not to go too much the wrong direction, because Eric actually is very involved in the research process, and he was like, hey, you tell him about Federalists this number and Anti-Federalists this number, and I was like, that's a lot of numbers. Let's just give them the thoughts of what they said. But we definitely will dive into this more and try to tell some more of the story of America's history connected to your questions when we can. Thanks for sending in questions.